Buddy. There we go. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started. We're letting people in the waiting room, so just give it about a minute or so, and we will get started. We are recording, so you probably want to keep your camera off. Please stay muted. There'll be time at the end for question and answer, Q&A with the audience, and you can put it in the chat or you can come off mute and ask a question. Um, and what else was I going to say? I think that's it for now. Let's see, anyone else waiting? There's one more person waiting to get in, so let's see if they get in and then get this started. Mm. Okay, I think they're almost in. All right, well, welcome everyone tonight. It is our official April book talk. We had two because we rescheduled March for April, but this was the official April. My name is Denisha Jones. I'm Executive Director of Defending the Early Years, and tonight we have two of the three authors of Screen Aware Early Childhood: A Realistic Approach to Helping Young Children Thrive in the Digitally Complex World. So Pat Cantor and Mindy Holohan are here. Unfortunately, Jean Rogers couldn't join us. She is the third of this team of authors who wrote this amazing book, which I was delighted to be invited to write the foreword. I showed my kids. I'm like, look, my name's on this book, guys. And they're like, so what, Mom? And I'm like, it's cool. Isn't it cool? No, they don't think it's that cool, but that's all right. I love it. I was really excited when asked and was able to write something to support it. And so that's definitely one of the books that we want to talk about today. So I have some questions that will guide our discussion. Again, there will be time and space for Q&A. You can put your questions directly into the chat or let us know you have a question and you'll be able to come off mute and just ask your question towards the end. But you can put your question in the chat anytime and I will get into it and I will follow it and do all those things as well too. Um, and I think at some point Mindy's going to share some slides to show you the framework and things like that. So we have a lot of really great information for you that I hope you'll enjoy. Even if you haven't read the book, this is a great introduction to get you to go out, get it, and read it because it is definitely helpful. All right, so my first question is let's begin with sharing what made you decide to write this book and create the Screen Aware framework for early childhood. And I'll open that up to whoever wants to answer.
I'll start us off and Mindy can jump in if she has other things she wants to add or correct me on. And Denisha, we thought it was really cool that you wrote the forward. You were our first choice, so we were thrilled that you
Thank you.
agreed. So you can tell your kids we think it's cool too.
Thank you. I will let them know.
And greetings from our colleague who couldn't be here, Jean Rogers. We're sorry she just had a conflict she couldn't get past. So the three of us met about 10 years ago now. I was trying to think back how long, and it really is close to 10 years, at a conference of an organization that was then called the Campaign for a Commercial Free Childhood. Now it's called Fair Play. It's an advocacy organization devoted to raising awareness about screen issues and screen impacts on young children, particularly focused on the ways that advertising targets children. I shouldn't say young children, children and youth. And Jean was just starting as the director of the Children's Screen Time Action Network, now called the Screen Time Action Network, at Fair Play. Mindy and I had both been working for years on our own and with other colleagues on issues related to screen impacts on young children. We'd been teaching about it, presenting about it, doing professional development about it. And at this conference, the three of us just found each other and really clicked. We discovered we had a lot of the same interests and we're doing similar kinds of work. So we spent a lot of time talking at the conference. Jean convened a group of others at the conference who were really interested especially in early childhood. And that became the seed that turned into the early childhood working group of the Screen Action Network. Mindy has been one of the co-chairs of that group for quite some time. And one of the first things that group did as we got together was really talk about what would be most helpful to early childhood practitioners who are dealing with the impacts of screen media on children, in their daily work, in their work as practitioners, and also in their personas as parents and grandparents and concerned adults. And one of that group kind of hit the ground running and immediately became interested in doing different kinds of advocacy work and preparing materials. One of the first things the group did was conduct a survey of and extend hundreds of early childhood practitioners about what would be helpful for you in figuring out how to make decisions about screen use with young children. And one of the top answers was we want free, helpful resources, clear resources for ourselves and for families. And Mindy and I started working on the screen early childhood screen action kit. Is that what it's called, Mindy? I think
Screen
so.
aware early childhood
Screen aware
advocate.
early.
Yeah, I know.
Everything we do is screen aware.
Everything screen
Uh,
aware, screen aware.
so we worked on that, and others became involved in that project. It took us a few years, but we got that off the ground, and that resource is still available. It's excellent fact sheets and action steps for practitioners, for families, activities to share with families, resources to share with families. We began presenting, the three of us together on this, and presenting about the action kit and on some of the other work we were doing. And we kept hearing from people attending our presentations at national conferences how they wanted more. And we were approached by a wonderful editor, our wonderful editor, Sarah Jubar at Teachers College Press. And she had attended a presentation and said, how would you like to write a book about this? And we worked together on that, building on what we had previously done and doing some new work for about a year, I guess. And our book was the result of all that collaboration. I don't know if
Yeah,
I
I love
missed
that.
anything.
I have another friend who was gave it a presentation and an editor heard her and got her to do a book. And I think that's a great way, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
most of us are just sending our proposals off, like please publish. But it's really nice when they hear you because then they
Yeah.
really understand what you're talking about and they're supporting it as opposed to like you coming to them with the idea, which they might agree with, but I think it's better so much when they like they come for you because they want to publish your work, which is
Mhm.
it's
And
really
it's also, it was much easier to take on this project as a collaborative venture with two colleagues I knew
yes.
and trusted and had
Yeah.
worked with than it
Yeah,
would
for
have been
sure.
as an individual.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's helpful when you have people like keeping on you for those writing deadlines, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Anything you want to add to the origin story there, Mindy? I did share a link to the Scream Time Network. And yeah, I can share anything else that you want in
Yeah.
the chat as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a very potent, gratifying um, project. And, the ultimate objective for us, and this is, always the foundation of our workshops and presentations and things that we've done over time and had the chance to, you know, learn and engage from different, you know, audiences and attendees and things is, just the overall arching goal is just for it to have the work be relevant
Mhm.
and of use, and responsive really to the needs and realities of practitioners on the ground. Um, and so yeah, and I say, yeah, we talked about, kind of, you know, going through like the gestational, process and the birthing process. Um, and we laughed because it was more like, I don't remember exactly how long an elephant's pregnant for, but it was more on towards that end of the scale than like the human egg. But yeah,
The
we're
human,
so
gotcha.
so thrilled to have it be in the world
Good.
and be
Awesome.
resonating.
Mhm.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is a labor of love. I've been there. I'm working on one now too, and trying to get another one in the works, and it's like, ah.
Mhm.
So, you state in the introduction that this book does not deny or diminish the many ways screen technologies help families, caregivers, and educators. And I think that's important because I feel like it's so polarized around screens. There are people who are like, no screens, zero screens. And there are people
Mhm.
who are like, what can we do? Right? Like they're
Mhm.
here. We have to get used to it. And I feel like there's got to be a middle ground, right? Because, yeah, I don't think we can go back to a place where there are no screens. And when I talk to parents of teenagers who are trying that, like their kids are using other kids' devices and they have social media accounts and
Hmm.
they're
Hmm.
just doing it behind their back, right? And so I don't
Hmm.
think that that's like a best policy, but people do need support, right? So you're not advocating we go back to a time when there are no screens because I don't think any of us believe that's possible. But tell us, what do you mean by screen aware and how does it work in our current context where screens are highly embedded and not going away?
Yep. So you pretty much nailed it. I mean, this was our experience in, finding that a lot of the conversations, um, advisement, messaging, was kind of taking place at either end of the spectrum that you just kind of described there. That, this kind of screen-free tech, you know, yeah, screen-free kind of arguments, and then many of which are justified, and then the whole, the other side of the spectrum being, many are justified but not realistic, I would say, for like the majority of families or practitioners even, right? Because of the way our programs are set up and maybe, the use of screen-based technologies might be required. So like, and then the other end of the spectrum, being both kind of what you described as like, okay, it's here, we'll just throw up our hands and this is the way it is. And also the other end of the spectrum, and this is a little bit more the insidious kind of dimension is like where there's a lot of like messaging around the purported and largely unsubstantiated purported benefits, right, of these like really hyper digital um, orientations, like for
Mm,
learning, and seeing that creep, younger and younger,
yeah.
and as well, from like ed tech, educational technology companies and things like that, and also from like, um, you know, places that don't even try to um, have any educational kind of expertise, but still claiming something is educational regardless, right? So
Hmm.
just a lot of confusion, and then just a not a, and this again is like from surveys of families and parents um, that it just, a lot of the guidance that is provided was not resonating. It would either be like very prescriptive,
Hmm.
and not realistic, um, or, like just overwhelming
Yeah.
and confusing. So yeah, that was kind of like um, a bit more of our, I guess, origin story. And then yeah, Screen Aware, because of those reasons, was very intentional, right? Um, and aiming to like really meet the broader middle of the spectrum, addressing those real world like realities and conditions
Hmm.
um, that we know are new and emerging, and that there aren't largely like examples for, or mentorship for, or things, because they are so recent, the
Mm.
developments,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And then yeah, something that could really respond to those needs on the ground. So um the way we define screen awareness
Hmm.
is the knowledge and the practices, so the knowledge and practices that uphold the developmental well-being and the developmental rights. So
Mm.
of young children within
Yeah.
our screen-based, media-centered, centric society and culture. So we hope that, within that definition, we consider, the developmental impacts of screen-based technology, including time, which we talked about, like we're part of the Screen Time Action Network, but it's not just time. It's also the nature of the use, the reason for the use, Are we using it to mitigate or manage behavior? That's very different than using it as a time to sit down and co-view a developmentally appropriate show. Like there's that the
Yeah,
spectrum
yeah.
of use, not just time.
Hmm.
And then, again, the nature of the content. So we um, think about it, it's a multivariable um, front, right? And then how like we are being informed by knowledge and research that's both, generalizable,
Hmm.
but also that is considering like those that the individual needs, like in terms of child development and the impacts on child development, but also the individual needs of the child. Um, thinking about we think screen awareness also it's important to consider the developmental harms
Mhm.
stemming from digital technologies and some of the problematic systems and design, and
Hmm.
also the potential benefits, right? And,
Yeah,
and understanding that it's not one way or the other,
yeah,
but we want to grow our understandings of those. And then, you know, developmentally appropriate uses, impactful uses. The body of research is growing. We do have a lot we can learn and draw from, and then also like high impact, like intervention strategies when it does tip towards being more problematic, um, and prevention and education strategies and all that good stuff. Oh, I want to
yeah.
say one more thing. I think screen
Sure,
awareness
sure.
also means our own awareness as adults. So
Yes.
Mhm.
our relationships with screen-based technology and the impacts, understanding the bi-directionality of
Mhm.
our relationships with young kids and of all of our relationships really, and how that also is impacting their development.
Yeah.
So some
I feel like
terms that we love. Some of our
yeah,
favorite
yeah.
terms come out of that realm.
Yeah. I feel like
Mhm.
I'm an digital elitist, right? Because like me and my daughter will be sitting at the dinner table and I'm on my phone and she's on her phone, but I'm playing games so that I don't lose my mind. Like I play like a lot of games because I'm trying to like, memory strengthening and she's just watching videos on 3 times speed. I'm like, it's not the same. Then I'm like, stop being an elitist. You're both on screens. You feel like what you're doing has more value than what
Right.
she's doing, but she
Do as I
doesn't feel that
say, not
way.
as I do.
Exactly,
Do as I do.
exactly. So it's like we have to both put away our phones, right? It doesn't
Mhm.
matter what I'm
Mhm.
looking at, or I use mine for work and you use your, it doesn't matter, right? We
Exactly.
have to, because I think parents, they're like, we're trying to justify it, but the
Right.
truth is we're all on our screens all the time.
Right.
I'm
Mhm.
And
just, I
that's what
mean, yeah. And then
I
when I'm
feel
not on
you.
my phone, I'm old enough that I'm on the TV. These kids don't watch TV the way like I watch TV. So I
Right.
feel like, oh yeah, I monitor all of our screen use on the Apple app, right? And I'll
Mhm.
say, look, I was only on for 5 hours this week. And they're like, yeah, but how much TV did you watch, Mom? I'm like, you got me, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
got me.
right. Exactly. It's there's so
Yeah,
many
yeah.
dimensions and
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
how do we find a way like how do we orient ourselves? What should we be, prioritizing the most or thinking, and so that's
Yeah,
really,
yeah,
what we has driven us like out of our own curiosity
yeah, yeah.
and work
Mhm.
and advocacy. Um, but yeah, I think, when you talk about that, with the dynamics with kids, I mean, a young child, right? You're talking about teenagers, right? I've got
Hmm.
teenagers. I have the same, thing going on, or young
Yeah.
adults.
Hmm.
Young
Hmm.
children aren't going to differentiate. They just know
Mhm.
that that adult is not
Paying
Exactly.
present,
attention.
Yep, yep,
is
yep,
not
yep.
respond. And
Mhm.
there's a term that is researchers are starting to use, and I encountered it even after the book was published, and I wish I had encountered it earlier. I don't know
Hmm.
if it was in the mix earlier, but this notion of what are the impacts of continuous partial attention,
Mhm.
Mm.
by
Hmm.
adults, you
Yeah.
know?
And
And I
kids
think,
notice that and they say
Oh
things in
yeah.
classrooms and we hear. Even like one time when my friend's daughter, they're teenagers now, but they were little and I was, I'm with them and I'm on my phone and she's like, Misha, did you hear me? And I said, yes. And she goes, you're not listening. You're on your phone. And her mom's
Hmm.
like busted. Like they're very, because the parents took a very like limited screen through their whole first 12 years of life, right? So me sitting there on my phone was not what the mom and dad did. They were very careful to like not be
Hmm.
on it in front of them.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, they're aware. They're aware that you're not really paying attention when you say you
right?
are.
Hmm.
Or they don't
If you're
even
looking, yeah.
Hmm.
try.
Yeah. Or they
Hmm.
don't even
At
try to
some
talk
point,
to you. Yeah.
they just see the adult on the phone, and you know, have observed this myself. They just don't even make the overture,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The we think about serve and return, and we all know the importance of
Hmm.
that.
Yes. Yes.
Like the serve, it doesn't even happen
Yeah.
Or
because
the serve might be throwing a tantrum and
Oh
right,
screaming to
yeah.
get
Yeah.
or
attention
take a
and
different form.
acting
Yeah, take
out.
a different, yeah, because they know
Yeah.
you're not fully present, right? And so
Right.
yeah, and so we've talked about it.
Right.
I mean, there was one time I said, "Look, we're going to dinner with this family. We don't know. Let's just leave our phones in the car, all of us." And it was
Hmm.
hard, but we did, right? We just like let's just see what happens if we just leave our phones in the car, just to try, right? And there are
Hmm.
times when we're on vacation. I'm like, guys, we're going out to eat. Let's put the phones down. Like, let's put it
Hmm.
away and let's try. And then we'll sit there quiet for like 10 minutes, and I'm thinking, oh my God, we have nothing to talk about. But then the conversation comes, right? And I remember one
Hmm.
time my son was like, "This is nice having dinner and talking like this." I'm like, "I know we
Hmm.
don't do it anymore because you eat dinner in your room and me and your
Hmm.
sister sit here glued at our phones, you know?" And it's like, it's
Hmm.
yeah, it's important to really think about those things, right? You talked about the
Hmm.
developmental impact, and this is really important to me because I remember when Diane Levin was teaching, she gave this great presentation at NACI once where she talked about like how a child interacts with an object, right? And like how
Hmm.
all of the neurons that fire in the moment of like turning it, looking at it, all these different things, and then how like none of that happens when it's on a screen because you don't
Hmm.
have all the tactile sensing that would create
Right.
those neurons. So I don't know. And then I don't know if the research, you said the research is growing, but is it really being done to show the impact of screen? Because I feel like there's a big lobby against that kind of research. And we all
Yeah,
know
but
that like
increase,
there,
yes, it's
yeah,
breaking
yeah.
through. It's breaking through.
Okay,
And
good.
I just when I said I don't want to leave these out. So the some of our favorite words or
Hmm.
terms coming out of the research on this
Yeah.
night
Hmm.
Hmm.
are and things that tend to really resonate are the notion of technoference. So the way that technology interferes with our interpersonal relationships, right? And then
Yes.
also technoavoidance. So the way we use technology to maybe avoid uncomfortable
Hmm.
um, interactions, to mitigate, you know, uncomfortable behavior with young children,
Yeah.
to yeah, so to kind of self-soothe, right? Like,
Hmm.
so I think that there's some really interesting work, and when Pat mentioned some the fact sheets, um,
Hmm.
as part of the action kit, we do have one on techno avoidance, and that tends to be a pretty popular one.
Like that.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I can only imagine that that's what and the kids. I remember, I mean, I talked to Josh when, before, I think it was before you guys became um the current name. Sorry, it was still back in
Fair
the
play.
campaign.
Fair
Fair
Yeah,
play.
play.
before it
Yeah.
became Fair Play. But I remember because we were I was must have been in Boston for something because we were in person talking, and there was like some toy coming out where it was like an AI in the crib type thing. I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, like, and it's just like the thought that no one in the toy industry in the business world thinks that, like, what are the ramifications of having a child, a baby, an infant become dependent on an
Hmm.
AI voice to soothe? Like there's so like the thought that that doesn't cross anyone's mind. Not that we can do this, but should we, and
Hmm.
why we shouldn't? Because how dangerous is that? And it's like I get not everyone knows child development, but like if they're not even like anyone saying, this feels weird, guys, right? Like this is strange. I
Hmm.
know they got it.
Hmm.
You guys fought and got it stopped. They one of those toy things that I sign on, and
But
yes,
it's like
we are signing
whack-a-mole. You
on. Yeah,
get one
because they
down and another one pops right up.
I
And I'm
know,
sure
Right.
and they
people
just
have so
they
many
repackage it
examples
under
of these, right?
another idea, and
Yeah.
so it's just I
Hmm.
love what I love about the book and the framework is that you start with the research and development, and that's super important, right? Because it has to be grounded. I think everything we I feel like in education, especially early education, there we have so much research, we have so much knowledge, but it's not being used in the policies and practices that are being put forth by the companies, right? And it's like what's like
Exactly.
how do we like we're drowning in research and knowledge about what children need, but we're actually not utilizing or we're not allowed to
Hmm.
utilize some of it, and that's really problematic, right? And
And I
so
think
Hmm.
that
yeah,
addresses that second part of what we talked about is child rights. I mean, we
Right.
don't
yes, yes,
have a child, we don't have that orientation, in the US in particular, Um, we have not signed on to something like the UN Charter for the Rights of the Young Child, which actually has made amendments having to do with digital technologies
Hmm.
yeah,
that are
yeah,
actually
Hmm.
quite impressive.
yeah, yeah,
So you see a very different now. I mean, it's pervasive everywhere,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But it does not mean that it's taking the same shape
No, no, no.
internationally,
Yeah.
and I think that's an important, that also has been something that hopefully you encountered in the book is also
Hmm.
that kind of looking at it from what can we do, as
Yes.
practitioners, and then also that, the systems level
Yeah, yeah.
interpretation. So we really root,
Hmm.
the book in Bronfenbrenner and, the bioecological, that's really, a theoretical foundation for us because I mean,
Yeah. When I
it
taught Bronfenbrenner to
holds
my
it all,
students,
right?
yeah, we would always
Hmm.
discuss like where media fit in terms of socializing because I think it's almost in the microsystem for this generation, right? Like
Oh, totally.
it's
Yeah.
not out there. It
Absolutely.
used to be for my generation, it was part of the
Hmm.
macro system, right?
That's
Media.
Hmm.
right.
No, I mean these kids today, media is a main micro, part of their
Hmm.
socialization, just up there with the family and school and peers because it's so prevalent in their lives. Like the kids are just even here. I'm in South America and Colombia, and people think it's a developing third. Well, whatever. Everyone has phones. Like all kids are on
Hmm.
Hmm.
devices. Like I go to the hairdresser and it's the same thing. All the kids have a device in their hand, and I get it because people are busy and you're trying to keep the kids busy. And I'm like, what happened? The pens and paper and crayons and
Hmm.
drawing or letting kids be bored and like coming up
Hmm.
with cool games, right? None of that is happening anymore. So yeah, it's global and people are starting to realize, right? I think it's Sweden. It's going back on devices in schools, either Sweden or Denmark, I think recently said
Hmm.
they're pulling it all back. They're like, and we're looking at it. There are of course places here that are trying to pull back from that as well too, because it's very challenging. So let's talk about the framework, right? Can you briefly
Hmm.
tell us about it's called Screen Aware Framework for Early Childhood and what it offers to parents and educators of young children?
Yeah. And this is when I wanted to
Yeah,
share my
share the
screen
screen.
because it can
Yeah.
be, I think, helpful maybe to have the visual while we talk about it a bit. Um, I also, while we're talking Bronfenbrenner and technology, while I get it pulled up, Pat, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about neo-ecological, just because I think this audience might be interested.
Yeah. One of the theoretical foundations that we talk about in the book is
Hmm.
neo-ecological theory, which is building on Bronfenbrenner
Yeah.
to present another kind of realm, which is the virtual realm, that children now exist not only in physical environments, but virtual environments
Hmm.
simultaneously. And
Hmm.
like you were saying, Denisha, that virtual environment pervades every aspect of the
Yeah.
ecosystem. So the
Yeah.
micro system, the macro system, and all the exchanges between micro and macro systems. And a
Yeah.
child can be physically in the physical environment, like in a classroom, but in a virtual environment, playing a video game with someone in Costa Rica or somewhere else in the world, while
Hmm.
simultaneously chatting, you know, IMing with someone else. It's
Yeah.
really complicated to think about childhood now as both a virtual and physical reality, as
Hmm.
opposed to childhood not very long ago. You know,
Yeah.
when Bronfenbrenner created his system, like you were saying, TVs were in a room in the house, and that was the primary screen, and often people would watch it together. And when children were away from it, they were away from it, but
Yeah.
they can't ever really be away from it now.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really good point. Yeah. I think yeah, the ubiquitous of it all and just how it's yeah, and it's a so it's a socializing agent, right? Because the whole theory of
Right,
Rauschenbrenner is that all of these things are socializing the
right.
child. And so how it is this media as a like almost like what did they say? So I think of like I thought of the third place, third life, but like an actual space that children are
Mm,
in as they're
mm,
developing. Like what implications does it have? Like, how are they being socialized and what's not happening? I think for me, it's like what's not happening to children's socialization and development, which is hard to measure, right? Like as a
right,
researcher, we don't know because,
right.
right? But I feel like there's so much like what are the differences between a child growing up like that and a child like
Mm,
myself, who I say proudly, I'm the last generation of kids who played outside all day long till the street light came
right.
on the
Hmm.
weekends in summer. Like that was my childhood, and I am grateful for that. But right, that started
Hmm.
to end. I was born in 77, and so I was doing
Uh-huh.
that, straight through 87, early 90s. But that ended
Hmm.
for a lot of kids who came up
Right.
around that time where
Hmm.
they did not go out and play all day. They were in structured activities or they weren't, and then we started to move into this technology era. So yeah.
Well, and then you also think about, you know, what does this mean for families' capability to know the environment their child is in? Like maybe when you were outside all day, your parents didn't know what you were up to,
They
but
had
they
no
kind of
idea, which
did.
is okay, but
But your world was limited. I
it
mean,
was,
now
yeah.
a virtual world means children are getting influences from all over the place.
Yeah.
Parents have no way to vet
No way to
that.
know
I
it.
mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
really
yeah.
hard.
They knew
So
I was
it's
within the city limits, right? But
right,
they,
right,
but they
right.
knew we were, and we weren't going too far. But yeah, I mean, now you don't know who your kid. And I told
No.
my kids all the time, you don't know who you're talking to. One of the things I noticed that they were doing on Instagram was going live for their. I said,
Hmm.
anybody can join your live, right? And they were like, what? I'm like, anybody. So I
Right.
joined, and I was like, what are you doing? Cut this off. You're like broadcasting. They're like, what is your mom doing in here? And I'm like, because anybody can join. And they didn't like catch that. They thought it was just for their
Yeah.
friends. And I'm like, no, I just can, anyone who sees that live can like jump in there and watch you and
Hmm.
participate. You don't want that. Close it off. Close it up. You want to, so like, here's my Zoom account. You want
Hmm.
to, you want
Hmm.
a way to talk to everybody and see everybody. Like now that I realize why my son was constantly using the Zoom account because that's what they were
Right.
trying to create.
Hmm.
And they thought Instagram Live was the way to do it and didn't realize that no, your
Hmm.
profiles are open. Anybody can join in and watch, and you wouldn't know that they're even there if they don't say anything. So yeah,
And
it's just a lot of differences.
advertisers use that to target kids,
Hmm.
and we might talk more about this later, but in the book we do try to give specific recommendations for how to, I mean, you can't control everything, but how
Yeah,
to
yeah.
make it safer, and
Hmm.
how to advocate for policies that protect children's rights. We make the point that there's an expectation, I think, in the US that parents are responsible for controlling their own kids' screen
Yeah.
encounters. And it's too much.
It's way too much.
It's
Yeah.
a juggernaut, and parents
Hmm.
can't do it alone. It requires
No, no.
collective action and policy.
Yeah, yeah. The friend I mentioned with the two little girls, they all got together, all the parents, and they moved into a really nice suburban close-knit community, and they had to all agree, 12 years old,
Hmm.
no one can get a phone before
Right,
12.
right.
You're going to ruin it for everybody if one little girl comes in
Hmm.
at 10 with the phone, like, and it was hard but they had to like agree and hold it to a pack. Like, we're not
Yeah.
going to budge on this because otherwise, and it's like, yeah, you can't do it by yourself because again, then your kid's at their house using their phone and
Hmm.
using their device, and there's nothing you can do
Right.
about that. And it worked. The girls are 12 now, and they're
Hmm.
limiting it. And I, shared my experience with like limiting cell phones with locks
Hmm.
on and times and all that, and it's helpful. But yeah, it's you can't do it by yourself. It's a community, right?
Hmm.
We're all
Yeah.
in this together, and we need to work together as parents, right? But some parents
Hmm.
don't agree. I know a 4-year-old who was given a phone by their father, and I rightly lost my
Right.
mind when I heard that.
We see
I was
that,
like,
right.
"What?"
Differences. between households with children going back and
Yeah, yeah.
forth. You
But
know,
and
that's
that was
Right,
it. He
absolutely a
thought, well,
very
I need to be able to reach her, right? Because the
right,
parents are
right.
separated.
yeah,
I need to be able to
yeah,
reach her. And I'm like, dude, you can reach her on her mom's phone. This is like, but they
Hmm.
don't get it, right? They don't get that what it does to a 4-year-old. And she's such a great, precocious little child who
yeah.
Hmm.
plays and does all this stuff, but she'll stare at that screen
Right.
and the useless scrolling. That's what bothers me. Like, what? Why
Hmm.
are kids just scrolling YouTube, just videos
Right.
popping up, the AI slop. And I'm like, that's
Mm,
problematic. If she has a phone and it's for phone calls or video chats, okay. But you let her just go on and mindlessly scroll, and you're not watching it with her. And so you
mhm,
don't know what's popping up in those
Hmm.
videos, right? When I
right.
watch my goddaughter and I'm just like, I don't like if I don't want to watch because I'm killing brain cells here watching this AI slop, but I have to
Yeah.
look at her and be like, this is no bueno, sweetie. Like, this is not good. It's just
Mhm,
because
Hmm.
they're just silly
mhm,
videos that they're like, but I don't think people realize that like they don't
mhm,
have any value to them at all, except to
mhm,
like it's engaged, right? And then
Hmm.
what are they doing to their development, right? Like it's just
Hmm.
it's a struggle. I get it. And I'm not blaming I mean, I was mad I'm still mad
Right.
at the dad for giving her the phone because that is a choice and she's 4. Like I'm gonna keep harping on him about
well,
that. But
sometimes parents think that is they're trying to do all the best, like the
yeah,
right,
they are.
like,
They
Hmm.
are.
and to
Yeah.
I can see that an argument like that that's I'm trying to provide, I'm trying
Right.
to have her
Yeah, and I'm
have
Stay
trying
the
to stay in her
connected.
thing,
life and I'm trying
you
to
know.
stay
Hmm.
connected, like
Hmm.
and co-parent with her mother and I
Right.
don't want to be dependent on her mother to talk to her. Like I get all of those
And
things.
what
I
that
totally do.
shows,
Yeah.
Denisha, and I think
Hmm.
this is why, and this is really why it is the, like we call it the North Star of our
Yeah.
framework,
Hmm.
is, you know, understanding and knowledge of child development. And I think
Yes.
that is the gap, the chasm that is
Hmm.
there between like the good intention, the love, the care. We go into this, we say with the premise that all families, parents want what's best for their child,
Hmm.
Do they have that always that developmental knowledge and understanding? Absolutely not.
Yes. Yes.
And
And most people
and
don't, right? We forget.
practitioners, our
They don't know it.
practitioners
Yeah.
do though.
Yes,
And
they
our
do.
practitioners are valued. And again, we know this from parental research data,
Hmm.
and surveys, is that early childhood practitioners are highly valued
Hmm.
sources of expertise. And so
Yeah.
that's a really tremendous opportunity,
Yes.
to um, impact, you know, yeah, to move the needle a bit,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to partner, to bring in and not, to break through the very valid frustrations, that a
Yep.
lot of us
Yep.
have in terms of what we're seeing and the problematic, impacts, the
Hmm.
displacement like you're talking about from
Yep.
other, it's not always just like, oh, I mean, it could be developmentally appropriate content. This is again why I
Yeah.
love the
Yeah.
screen
Hmm.
time use content paradigm, is
Hmm.
it could be
Hmm.
completely reasonable content,
Yeah.
but then, what isn't happening,
Exactly.
when we're doing this, when we're
Yeah.
interfacing. So like
And that, yeah. Yeah.
bringing,
Are
so
you?
and that
Mhm.
again was like the lens, the vantage point that we came at this work with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and also with the understanding that it's not a static, reality. Like it's changing rapidly. And you're talking
Hmm.
about AI slop. I mean, yeah, I mean, 6 months ago, that wasn't what children were,
Exactly.
Right. Right.
was their
Exactly.
Right.
primary
Yeah.
engagement. Although
Yeah.
YouTube was, by the way.
YouTube has been
Hmm.
doing it for a while, but it's getting more
But
everywhere. It's
but
getting,
YouTube
yeah.
on the
Hmm.
whole is actually the place that young children are engaging with screen-based media the most.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
but now this content creation stuff that's
Yeah.
just like you say, just slop is just like also that it's just that whole landscape is shifting even more, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
when we came at this and we thought about our framework and we thought about, we considered that was a primary consideration is like we don't want to be putting something out here that's going to be irrelevant in another 6 months.
Right.
We really wanted to have a way of, like something that was going to have long, that would transcend those conditions and also like time and just be kind of like universally applicable. And
Mhm.
that was kind of how this framework emerged. When I was putting it up, were you guys seeing it? Because
Yeah, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, put it up. Yeah,
were
I can
you
see it.
just seeing the framework?
Yeah, I think
Oh,
eventually.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, because
Yeah.
I have too many things going on right now.
And
And
if
I
Yeah,
did
we'll
Jean
let
were
you
mention
know.
it's
here,
the last week of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
semester, so the brain functioning is
I hear
on
you.
high.
I hear you. You're almost
if
done. You're at
if
the finish
Um,
line.
if
Yeah,
Jean were
Pat.
here, she would say something that we kept emphasizing in our conversations with each other as we were writing that we've talked about a lot.
Hmm.
Children's development hasn't changed. Evolution doesn't
Yes.
work that fast. Children's
No, no,
minds develop
no.
in the same way as they have, but technology changes
Jesus.
constantly.
Yes.
And that kind of tricks us into thinking children's minds are different because they're in a technological age, but that's not the case. So that's why our
Yeah.
framework is so grounded in children's development.
Yes.
And we put so much emphasis on practitioners' understanding of development and their expertise in development, because that is incredibly important knowledge to bring to making decisions
So we
about
can
children's
see
screen
everything. We
encounters.
can see your notes and all of that. I don't know if you
oh
want us to see
man,
that. Yeah, there's
You had it before.
that's a hot mess.
yeah, it's just it's hard with
Mm-hmm.
The heads
yeah,
up.
with the thing. You can
Okay.
yeah, you can go back to the original, but then you can't see it. I know it's tough to to see.
No,
I
yeah,
have to
I
have a
work with
separate
too many
screen. I
things
have an
open.
iPad and stuff. No, you can show us just the slide, but what you had up was the presenter slide. But
Right.
there should be another
Yeah,
one.
I got
But
it now. I
yeah,
do.
I to your point, Pat, I just shared a post where someone said that they said, "Oh, the kids are changed these days," and it's like kids aren't changing. The environment has changed, and it's and
Mm-hmm.
so we are they're different from us because they're growing up in a very different environment, right? And so
Right.
and I
Right.
just want to say like I was livid when I heard that the 4-year-old had a phone, but I did use what I learned from the book and I was like, okay, well look, all is not lost, right? Like so what I want you to do is limit her access
Mm-hmm.
to the phone. Other than phone calls with the parent and video chats with the
Mm-hmm.
parent, to no more than 20, 30 minutes a day. Like I begged them to put
Mm-hmm.
some limits on. And then my other thing was, and I want you to be with her while she's on it. Do not
So
use it
important.
as a babysitting tool. I
Exactly.
want you to sit her on your lap and watch the videos or do the scrolling with her and take a look at what she's seeing so that you see
Mm-hmm.
what it is, because I think that's the problem. It's this free reign. I remember my nephew, he's 11 now, but he also had this free reign of just scrolling you. And when I hear it and I'm like, bro, what are
Mm-hmm.
you watching? Right. And like nobody is watching it with him. And I think that's one of the choices, like the challenges, like you have to like engage, right? So limit what you can and engage and think about these principles that you guys are going to talk about next.
All right.
All right. Now you can see it, yeah?
Yes, yes,
Mm-hmm.
perfect.
Okay. Woo. Thanks for that. Um, so yeah, here is our framework. We refer to it as SAFE C, so the Screen Aware Framework for Early Childhood. Again, another one of our, foundational, like theoretical foundations was strength-based frameworks and practices. So that informed our approach. And this we think of this almost as like a compass, right? It's not a roadmap, like because the the routes are always there's new obstructions,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah.
flood over here, there's what so that doesn't work. I wish we had one, but it's just too complex. And as we've been discussing, like um multivariable, but there are things that I think can help us ori orient ourselves, um, center ourselves, and in turn help us, educate others um, with, again, these orientations. So we talked about our North Star being child development. So, is the decision I'm making, is the technology, the app, the whatever, development centered? Is it appropriate? Is it taking into consideration all of our knowledge about child development, again, generally, and then also the development of that particular child or group of children or things like that. Um, you know, my daughter is a parapro in a pre-K kindergarten classroom right now, and they've been around the holiday. They were doing all the different gingerbread man stories,
Mm.
and there was one kid, little boy. She told me the story of like could not handle knowing what was going to happen to that gingerbread cookie at the end, right? Like just the
Mm.
capacity for that was just beyond him. He couldn't, knowing it was going to happen, in some variation, shape, or form, right? So what is that capacity? And again, like that gets that's a book, right? When we think about media, we think about the stimuli, we think about the design, what toll is that taking? How is this adding? It might be again a perfectly reasonable activity or choice, but how is it adding to the what you kind of have the inkling or knowledge of the cumulative screen use and exposure of this child is is it does does the benefit of that particular opportunity that's screen based lose some of its um, advantage, knowing
Mm.
that it's going to add to this collective time, maybe a child who's, been already watching stuff for a couple hours before they got there.
Mhm.
So again, so both kinds of fronts with child development. And then again, is it research informed? Do I know that what it's this claim that it says, is it
Mm.
actually true?
Yeah, yeah.
Do I know, have I looked, have I um, considered the research? And again, we know that practitioners have so much going on, and that was part of why we approached. I mean, we both, Pat and I both have backgrounds in classroom practice,
Hmm.
um, and kind of came up through higher ed, through the back roads and routes. So, you know, knowing how full the days are and how demanding and how many things we're trying to manage and hold and understand, it's a tall order to keep up with it all, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what we tried to do is, kind of really translate it, filter it, down and get it in a way that's usable. Is it rooted in relationships? We all know that that's paramount for young children and their learning and their growth.
Hmm.
Um, Something again like co-viewing, where we're in relationship, we're talking about something, is very, very different than a child individually on an iPad.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, again, is it protection oriented? We cannot, like you've just keep kids in bubbles. I've tried in my own
Yeah.
parenting. It doesn't work. The exposure
Mm.
still happens. The breakthroughs still happen. And so, but yet we still want to be considering again, like their right to be free of things like exploitation or
Yeah, yeah.
potential exposures and things. So is it protection oriented? If we're using an app, do we or ed tech, do we know that it's maintaining their privacy? Do
Mm.
we know, all of that? So that is
Mhm.
our framework, and we
Yeah.
go into this in great deal. The time is flying here, so I don't want to take
Yes, it is. No, no,
too
it is.
much more
But
time
I
on it.
love it. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing the framework. I think it's very helpful and it's in the book and you guys, and it's probably in the toolkit as well too.
Mhm.
So let's talk about, you mentioned the research in the child development, which we love. Can you share any like important facts about screens and child development from the research that you think, right, like the audience should know? And, not a lot, not a ton, because I know there's a lot, but maybe what's the most like, impactful thing that you
Mm.
read about that you're like, wow, if
Mm.
parents knew this, right? I've just had the analogy while you were talking, Mindy, about like a pool, right? Like we are as
Mhm.
parents, like water, we know how dangerous water can be. And it's not right? It's a fun. We go swimming, it's a great, but we are very protective of children and we
Mhm.
know that they can't just we can't throw them in the water and they can't swim and we're very, and I wish we saw screens as water, right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
yes, it's a part of our lives and it's everywhere and it's but we can't throw kids into the screen world without any type of protection, right? And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
let's start with the research and then we'll talk about those protections as well too.
All right, so I'll pick a few highlights, a
Okay.
few negative highlights from the research. And in the book we do say we're focusing on the harms in terms of the research, what the research tells us about the potential harms, because we want to make sure that people are starting from an informed place so they
Hmm.
can make wise decisions. We know that a lot of screen use can really impact children's ability to learn self-regulation.
Yeah.
It takes children a long time to learn self regulation, managing their emotions, regulating their responses, maintaining attention and focus, building executive function. And if we're constantly putting screens in front of them when they're upset or they're bored or to soothe them, they're not going to develop those self regulation skills. They're going to be looking for an outside intervention to do that. Again, it takes children a long time to do that. Adults are supporting the building of self regulation by co regulating with children, by helping them learn to self regulate over many years. But when screens displace that, that's potentially harmful for a child. We know that screen use can have a really negative impact on sleep, not just in children, but in all of us. It's
Hmm.
impacting newborn sleep right on up. I
Oh,
just saw some
goodness.
new research today from the UK that said that 1 out of 10 babies, really young infants, were being put to sleep by screens.
Mm,
That is a real concern. Many people think that screens soothe children or calm them to sleep, but actually they can be really stimulating. And as we
mm,
know, the blue light interferes with melatonin production. So, sleep, keeping screens out of children's bedrooms and away from bedtimes is really important. We know that screen use can have a negative impact on children's eyesight. The incidences of nearsightedness are increasing in young children worldwide. When we talk about the protective factors, a really important protective factor is giving children lots of outside time. That actually is beneficial for eyesight,
mhm,
among other
mhm,
many other things. We also know that really young children, up till about the age of 2.5 or even 3, can't learn from screens. They can't translate what they see on a two-dimensional plane to their three-dimensional reality. And
mm,
that's why the American Pediatric Association, the World Health Organization, have all recommended no screen use, if possible, for infants and toddlers, because I think many parents, and again, the advertisers tell you your baby needs this to learn, you want a baby Einstein, expose them to
mm,
this screen, but they can't learn from it. And
Mhm.
the research is clear about that. It's called a transfer deficit. Sometimes it's
mm,
called a video deficit. And I don't really like that term because it implies that the child is deficit in some
Mhm.
mhm,
way.
mhm,
But you can't take looking at a flashcard of, say, an orange and understand what an orange actually is, what it smells like, what it feels like, what it tastes like. It just doesn't transfer. You can't teach
yeah,
a task to an infant for them to be able to apply. So I think that's important. And then the other really important thing to keep in mind is that word technoference. Our screens, if screens are getting in the way of interpersonal relationships or replacing human connections with parasocial relationships, relationships with characters or avatars or AI or whatever, that can be very harmful to children.
yeah,
Young children need those human interactions. That's how they learn. They learn in the context of relationships. And if that learning is outsourced to screens, it's just not going to happen. It's
yeah,
not going to be supportive of the child's learning or their social emotional development either. I, I think those are some of the big ones I would take
yeah.
away.
Mhm.
I mean,
Thank you. Yeah, they're so
screens are
powerful. Yeah.
sedentary too, and that's harmful to
Yeah,
children.
yeah,
So,
that's a lot too. I think that the lack of the sensory is super important. We forget that that
mhm.
sensory motor stage of development is huge. And
Mhm.
if
Yeah.
they're not getting that because screens can't give you senses, they can't give you touch
Mhm.
and taste, and it's just one, it's just sight.
Mhm.
So like you're
Mhm.
overusing sight and not developing
Hmm.
your other senses. And we know that that's going to be make it really challenging for children, especially to be in other environments where all of their senses are at play. Now they might start being like unable to cope around that because they're so used to just being in a visually stimulating environment
Mhm.
and not one where they get to interact. And so I can imagine that that's tough. Yeah, I've
Hmm.
definitely seen the self-regulation. I've heard parents tell me, and I've seen it where, their kid gets violently angry when it's time to turn off the
Hmm.
thing and they'll stop watching and they don't know what to do. And
Hmm.
I'm like, this is the part, this is the hard about letting them do it, right? Because it's controlling them, right? They're like,
Hmm.
no, no,
Right.
no, and like throwing and having this huge tantrum and fit. And so typically you give in and you let them keep watching because you
Hmm.
don't feel like you can go undo, right? I think that's the hardest thing for parents that once you start, you feel like you can't stop, but you actually can, right? And even my kids
Yeah.
told me that. I'm like, I should
Yeah.
have limited your time on the phone for the day instead of just making you get off at a certain time. And they're like, well, mom, you pay the bill, you can do whatever you want, right? And I was just like, true, but I felt like I already gave you a lot of room, and so that's what I really tell parents is like start with less so that you can
Hmm.
go to more. But when you start with more, you're going to feel weird sometimes than trying to go back
There's
to less.
definitely a
Hmm.
transitional
Yeah,
painful
yeah,
phase, but
Right.
it's surprising, how quickly that does lift.
yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
And again, we're talking about within the realm of like typical maybe exposure when we have more problematic use, and then we actually do have some, you know, what researchers, call problematic is when, it's really disrupting like developmental milestones,
Hmm.
and so there we have a lot more ground, to
yeah,
make
Hmm.
up.
yeah. Yeah, I
Um,
think the speech
yeah.
issues have come up a lot, speech delays
Hmm.
around
Yeah,
kids on
and
young kids on screen. And I
they're
think
some of the
people
most
don't,
active part
yeah,
folks
yeah,
in the early childhood work group are speech and language paths
yeah,
because
yeah.
Right.
they're
And I
they're
think that goes to your point, Pat. People think, oh, they're going to learn from, they're not actually. They're not
mhm.
No.
actually learning to speak, talking to the, listening to the screen. It's
And it
not
can actually
developing this.
inhibit learning.
Yes. And I think that's so
Yeah.
counterintuitive to us because there
Right.
are good contents like Gracie's Corner and,
Mhm.
Miss Rachel and all that good stuff. But
Mhm.
that's not gonna get them speaking more. I think that's we want to believe. You
No.
know what gets kids speaking more? Reading books to them, right? Which
And
we know,
talking.
and talking,
Talking.
which we know that that's happening less, right? And I
Hmm.
hear parents are saying my kids can't read a book because screens interfere with your ability to like listen to that
Hmm.
audio, right? That audio input stimulation is not really well developed, like without the
Hmm.
visual. And so yeah, and we are too. I'm the same way. Look, I go to read a book, and I don't know how many times I spend the first 10 minutes
Right,
going back and
right,
going back and going back because I'm
yeah,
not paying attention. It takes me a good 30 minutes to settle in. I'm like, okay, I'm hooked. I'm in, I'm in, I'm
mhm.
in, and I'm reading. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have to, because I'm, so used to like short snippets. And so a
Right.
long text, I have to like really get myself
Yeah.
into the mood for
It's
it.
like
And
that muscle, it's just like
Hmm.
any
yeah,
muscle.
it's
Like
a
the more
muscle.
we use
Yeah.
them or the less,
And
the
less. And the more we use other things, they interfere with that for
Mhm.
sure.
And
Hmm.
So let's,
again, we're
yeah, go ahead.
talking with young, I mean, it's impacting all of us, and there's vulnerabilities across the lifespan. With young children, we're talking about like laying the foundation,
Yeah.
Hmm.
for
Yeah,
the entire,
exactly. It's the foundation. It's
so.
one thing as an
Hmm.
adult, and I know how to monitor my own comprehension. I know how to like, okay, you're not paying attention, go back and read that again. Or, you do better first thing in the morning before you get on social media to
Right,
read, right?
right.
I can do all those things, but like a child who's just learning all of these things,
Mhm.
this is how they're learning everything. So how are
Hmm.
they? I still don't, my kids are, I'm like, you're not ready for college. They're like, Mom, why do you say that? Because you can't work without all these distractions. And I don't,
Hmm.
and I see your work and I think it's a result. You're not getting good
Hmm.
grades because you're not. I mean, I get it. We're all learned differently, but I'm like, I don't really think you can focus and do a good job when you are blaring this TikTok video while you're supposedly
Mhm.
doing your work. It's call me crazy. I'm old fashioned, right? And so, but getting them to see that for themselves by,
Mhm.
okay, so I want you to do your work now for an hour with no distractions, and let's compare. Like the research in me is like, let's compare your
Mhm.
work with distractions and your work without, and kind of
Mhm.
see. But young kids aren't, they're not going to be able to do that, right? And even older
No.
kids. So let's talk about the protections because I think this is a really important part of the framework. In the forward, I wrote about my concern regarding my own kids' screen use and how I was already concerned about my screen use, but I know how to unplug and take a break, go outside, practice mindfulness, or meditate, right? So I recognize these as what you would call screen aware protective factors. Can you tell us, the audience, what are screen aware protective factors and why are they important? Because again, I think there's we can win this, right? I feel like we're not giving
Mhm.
up and throwing in
And
the towel.
this is the hopeful part in
Yeah.
my
Yes.
mind.
Yes,
Really,
exactly.
really,
Like the research
truly.
brings you down, the impact on development brings you down, the
Yep.
impact on relationship brings you down. But wait, wait, wait. We
Yep.
can create protective factors here, people.
Mhm. Yep.
And we drew these protective factors from, well, we got the idea of protective factors from the Strengthening Families protective factors, which many childhood practitioners are familiar with. But the goal of protective factors is to promote well-being of children and families, to build on strengths that they already have, to empower children and families to be advocates for themselves, and in the case of screen aware protective factors, to mitigate the harms that are inherent in screen media use. So some of those harms we were just talking about. And we drew these from the research about what we know children need and what benefits them, especially when they're dealing with screens. Number one is responsive relationships. When children are having responsive relationships with a caring adult, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, whatever, that can really reduce the impact, any negative impacts they're feeling from screens. So if a child sees something that's disturbing to them, maybe they're watching with an older sibling or a cousin and they see something that's disturbing, a caring adult will notice, maybe in the child's play or the child's drawings or the child's conversation, that they saw something that was disturbing to them and talk to them about it and reassure them. That's a responsive interaction that can be that can help to mitigate the harm that whatever that content was might have caused. And we give several examples of that in the book. Um, Another one is just play. One of my favorite words and one of
I
my
love it.
favorite activities.
Favorite four-letter word.
Play, free
Yeah.
play,
Yeah.
offline
Yeah.
really helps children develop
Outdoors.
executive function,
Yeah.
helps them develop social relationships, helps them develop self regulation. It's so important for their development. And we
Yeah.
don't want screens to be taking away from those opportunities for
Yeah.
offline play. So the more play, the better. And like you
Yeah.
said, outdoors, time in
Hmm.
nature, really healing for the spirit, good for the
Yeah.
eyesight, gets children physically engaged and engaged in physical activity, which is also a protective factor to mitigate the effects of sedentary use of screens or staring at a screen. So lots of time outdoors and in nature. Um, we also talk about critical media literacy practices,
Yes.
even starting with young children, helping them identify questions they can ask, especially to deal with advertising, like who made this? What are they trying to tell me? Are they trying to sell me something? Are they trying to make me do something? Why? Those kinds of questions, and talking with
Yeah.
children about that to help them develop those skills. And then another protective factor is resources for empowerment.
Hmm.
Sometimes those resources are other families or other colleagues with whom you share values. Like you gave the example of the parents all agreeing to hold off
Hmm.
Yeah.
phone
It's a
use
great
in their
example.
children.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
great example.
Yeah.
There's an example from the news today about parents in Los Angeles successfully getting their school
Yep.
district to
Hmm.
stop distributing
iPads. Yeah.
devices
Hmm.
to first graders.
Yep.
They're really getting the district to examine their policies because they're so concerned about the impact of screen use in schools, and especially the amount of YouTube kids are watching in school.
Yep.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, empowering resources like the Screen Time Action Network are really useful for as a protective factor, that it gives parents the kind of agency, parents and practitioners the agency and the power to be able to prevent some of these harms.
Yeah.
Anything else
Yeah.
you
I
want
love
to?
that.
We hope our book is an empowering resource.
No,
Yes, it
okay.
is very much an empowering resource, which is how I ended my foreword. I got this book. It's a resource. I can use it. I'm not throwing in the towel, even with my 20-year-old and
That's right.
soon
A
to be
lot of it.
20-year-old and 18-year-old. We still have to do this. They're not fully adults until they're 25,
No,
people. Like
I
we
know.
still have to impact the last
And
of the
they're
brain
still
development
learning
that's happening. They're still,
self-regulation.
yes, they're still learning self-regulation. And I think, they recognize it too. Like one time
Oh yeah.
I bought games for my goddaughter, but my daughter sat there and put down her phone and played with it for 2.5
Hmm.
hours, right?
Hmm.
Like when we go to places where there's no internet, like they love it. They kind of just
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
hang out and go into the
Hmm.
river and I
Hmm.
think I mean, they don't want it all the time, right? But I
Hmm.
think we
Right.
all like to unplug. I used to
Hmm.
love
Yeah.
going camping with my friends over the
Hmm.
holidays because there was no service. Now where we go,
Hmm.
there's service. I'm like, no, it's not as
Yes.
fun. It's not. It
Yes.
was so much better when you had to get in the car and drive to get your. And the first trip, I was there, like checking my phone, like I didn't think I could live without it. And then a year later, I'm like, what phone? Don't reach. Mom, don't call me for 3 days. I'm out. Like no service. Like I didn't
Yeah.
even need it, right? And
Hmm.
so it got to this point where it felt great. I looked forward to just going and disconnecting and saying, you're not going to be able to reach me for the next 3 days
Hmm.
while I'm at the camping.
Hmm.
And I wanted that and I miss it, right? And so
Right.
I'm looking for
Right.
places like that. Where can we go where like, yes, I need to be a place where I can go check, right? I want one
Hmm.
building. I want to go to a resort where one building has all the service and everything else has no and you just go in that one building for like a half hour a day, check all your messages, and then you're back to like, freedom from all of that, right? I think that's so
Right.
key. Well, thank you
Hmm.
guys. I want to open it up now for audience. If you have any questions, we have a little bit of time here. Mindy and Pat have been so generous talking about the book, and I know I've been chiming in, but we'd love to hear from you. You can put your question in the chat, or you can come off mute and ask a question. I mean, no, let me try and see. I don't know. I don't know if I'll see everybody. Let me see if I can go back to the general view here, so I can see everybody and see if anyone has a question. And while we're doing that, and while people are thinking, I can ask another question too, but I just want to check. Anyone right now want to ask a question before I do another one? Danielle, you look like you want to ask something. Is that true? Yeah, please. You just got to come off mute. Here, I'll give you this to ask you to. You're still muted, Danielle. Hold on. Did it work? I can send you a little thing that should pop up and say unmute, please.
No, I
See if
see
that
it.
worked. Did that work?
I think she typed it in.
Yeah.
No, no, we still can't hear
I'm
you.
sorry.
Hold
Did
on.
I sent it in the chat? Because
Oh,
my
there.
thing,
Oh, I got
yeah,
it. Oh, no, no,
there
we
was
can hear
my
you now. Perfect.
question.
Oh, okay, we can hear you now. Go for it.
Yes. So, I mean, I was just wondering, have you guys noticed differences or how the framework works across different cultures or socioeconomic context, stuff like that?
That's
If
a great
that's
question, Danielle. Thank you. Thank
Mhm.
you.
So,
Mindy, did you want to tackle that? Yeah, you look like you wanted to.
well, I guess I didn't. It's funny because I thought of saying it and then I neglected to say it, is that that was something else we saw as a need that informed this work. Um, so in particular, spending time in, a range of classrooms. I do a lot of work with like childcare providers and home-based childcare providers. Um, and so something that would um, be of value and again of use. And I only have anecdotal feedback. I would love to be able to do research around it.
Hmm.
Um, but we do hear just the framing is very helpful, and it was very much a part of consideration. And I think that goes back to that strengths-based foundation that we're building on, which
Mhm.
is recognizing and empathizing with you know and respecting the diverse family contexts and realities and situations and conditions. And if we just say screen time is bad, we are going to
Mhm.
lose. And this is, I mean, a
Yeah.
conversation we had,
Yeah.
early days. We are going to lose the majority of people we that have questions or that want to understand, because
Mhm.
it's we there's already so much shame around this. We again, we know this from um, some great, parent research
Mhm.
and surveys. So we know that that is like a major barrier, and we know that there's a lot of like it can tip, frustration can easily tip to blame, right?
Yeah.
With our dynamics with between families and
Mhm.
practitioners.
Mhm.
So how do we push through that? And that's really, again, been a priority. And again, informed by the work and experiences and workshopping with folks and from the ground up. And I was just going to say one more thing to that end. Um, but yeah, that really is the vantage point that we come from, that we established. Oh, I know what I was going to say. In the second half of the book, so like the first half, we focus on like um, building our understandings and sharing the research. So we call that cultivating screen awareness. And then in the second half, we talk about advancing it. And part of
Mhm.
the ways that we focus on advancing it is through effective communication strategies for
Mhm.
Mhm.
engaging with parents. Again, like through um, active listening and some of these great and like concrete ways of bridging some of the gaps. So, great question. Love that.
Yeah, yeah, thanks.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just want to share it. It's something I think about a lot too. I briefly mentioned it in the forward, when I was teaching kindergarten and we had a computer in the classroom and I was like, man, they're five. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, there was no internet, but games and stuff. And there were some kids that every day wanted to go to the computer center, never wanted to go to another center. Like, work hard to go there. And I just didn't like that that was always their
Mhm.
choice.
Mhm,
I didn't feel that way about any other center. You want to spend every day in blocks or dramatic play. I don't care. But the kid who wanted to go to the computer center worried me that, right, it was a
Mhm.
problem. And, it's in Washington, D.C., predominantly Black school and predominantly Black kids. And, it was like, oh, these kids are on the losing end of the digital divide. And so, first, I want to
mhm,
say anytime you hear anything saying that these kids need something that these kids don't need, and these kids are poor and Black and brown, and these kids are rich and white, stop. Just don't take it. It's not
Mhm.
right. Like, I don't
mhm,
care what situation or what context it is. All kids
mhm,
need the same things, right?
mhm,
Mhm.
And arguments that position poor and Black and brown kids as being on the wrong end of the digital divide, it's just used to to sell them more technology. I think what I'm a little bit more of conspiracy theorist when I think about this, right? But like, technology is set up for some people to be consumers and some people to be producers. And I
mhm,
think a lot of children, the poor, the children of color, they're set up to be consumers of tech, consumers of screen, and
Mhm.
consumers of AI, and consumers of that, where other kids are being primed to be producing it, to be on the managing side. And I think that's the divide, right? And
mhm,
so
Mhm.
all children are going to learn technology well. It's like, I don't even want to hear that. Oh, if you don't let your kid do the screen till they're 10, they're not
mhm,
going to. they're going to catch up in an hour. Okay. They're children. Like they're going to know how to use that stuff. It's not like
Mhm.
us still learning how to use our technology. And, my mom saying, I don't want a smartphone. I'm old. I want a dumb phone. Why can't I get a dumb phone? And it cracks me up because I totally get what she's saying, right? Like this screen tech is not good. She's 78 years old. Like she doesn't want to deal with it, but it's impossible to get her just to touch like a regular,
Right.
and so but a child who's 10 or 12 and getting their first, they're going to get it. They're going to get it a lot quicker. So I think those arguments are more about how things are sold and how things are marketed and less about what really children need, right? I think,
Mhm.
and so that's just my thought on that because I know it comes up a lot. And I think when I've heard that being used, especially in districts with low income children,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
COVID made
Yeah,
us put
there's a
laptops.
whole layer
Yeah.
of exploitation
Mhm.
there,
It is.
and
Yeah.
it's
And
also
like you said, it's the parents. They get blamed. They feel
Mhm.
like they're not doing, and we put so much pressure on parents, and that's the problem, right?
Mhm.
And so they feel like
Mhm.
maybe I am doing my kid a justice by having them watch this and do this or giving them so they feel like other kids or they're not feeling left
Mhm.
out.
Mhm.
But again, that stuff, again, it's really about the marketing. It really is.
Yeah. Well, you hear about all the parents in Silicon Valley who don't let their children
Yes,
have
don't let their kids at
screens
all.
and send them to Waldorf
So
schools where they won't be exposed
Montessori,
to
Waldorf,
screens.
they play
And
outside
they're the
all day long.
creators of this.
Yes, and they're
Yeah.
creating it, and they don't want their kids consuming it
Right.
at a young age because they
Right.
understand that that is not beneficial for the
Mhm.
child,
Mhm.
even if that's
Mhm.
how it's being marketed, right? And so
Mhm.
that's a great question, Danielle. Anyone else have another question? I think we're at a good point where we can. I know it's late for you guys. I'm in an hour earlier, but it's like 8:15. Oh my God, you guys must be so tired. If you're on the East Coast, sorry if you're not. But yeah, I did just want to point out and note that the book there's a framework, there's an online action kit that you mentioned,
Mhm.
Mhm.
and so it's called Advancing Screen Awareness. And yeah, I just want to share that and let people know, and maybe when I send out the recording to everyone who registered, I can include a link to that as well too,
Mhm.
so people can
Mhm.
take a group and
And
you
we
can learn.
have
Yeah,
the action kit is available in both English and Spanish.
yes,
Yeah.
That was one
great.
of the biggest requests that we had,
Yes,
Mhm.
yes.
was for a Spanish language
Yeah,
translation.
I will
Really
share that with
happy
my
to be able to get
Colombian.
that in the mix. Yeah,
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 my
yeah.
Oh,
my
great.
Colombian
Great.
folks here because they're always,
Mhm.
I have the iPad, so when my goddaughter asked to use it, but they're like, well, why? I tried to explain to them like I bought all this other stuff, and so that it's very limited when she comes over. I'm like, do you
Mhm.
want to paint? Do you want to draw? Do you want to do this? And because I think, I say, look, and they're like, well, it's your iPad. I said, no, it's not about whether she can use my iPad. I think just generally she should not be on iPads that much during the day. And
Mhm.
so can we limit this? And so maybe I'll send them that resource in
And again,
Spanish and
we
say,
we
yeah,
wanted them to be we implement best practices in terms of, Jean's a parent educator, I'm a family life educator, in terms of like effective um material development. So we had all of the sheets vetted, like
Mhm.
reviewed by different families. I should have mentioned this, Danielle. Um,
Mhm.
from different backgrounds, and across the US. So we also, that was part of our process. We got actual family
Mhm.
feedback. We heard what they appreciated, what they liked, what maybe they didn't understand, what maybe rubbed them the wrong way, what um, they wanted more of, and we worked to integrate that. So
Mhm.
that was part of the process with the action kit.
Yeah.
Not that it's
awesome.
perfect. No,
Yeah, no, of
nothing
course. And there's
is.
always going to be some families who
But
disagree with any of it. But
that was
yeah, yeah,
we really, we're trying to come at it from a spirit of partnership and respect, you know, um,
absolutely.
and all that good stuff.
Awesome.
Mhm.
All right. Well, on that note, I am going to, where am I at? There it is. Hold on. I'm going to share this very quickly. Oh, no, I'm not. 'Cause that's like that. I want to first thank Mindy Holohan and I said that right? Right? Holohan.
Yeah.
And
Although when I taught, the kids used to always think it was holler hand.
of
So
course
I'd be like,
they
"Wah,
did.
wah." Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
And Pat
Holler.
Cantor and Jean Rogers, who couldn't be with us, for writing this amazing book, for asking me to write the forward, and for agreeing to have to be our book talk as well too. Thank you guys so much. I hope everyone found found it really useful. Just really quickly, I just want to share. No, no, it's not. This one. No, that is it. Okay, there we go. All right. So I sorry, this is not our next book talk. This is the next scheduled. There we go. Put it in prevent mode. This is going to be in June. We're going to have another one in May, but I don't have there we go. I don't have the date yet because I'm still waiting to confirm. But on Wednesday, June 10th, Alyssa, and I'm sorry, I have not spoken to her, so I don't know how to say her last name. So I'm just going to say Alyssa M, who works for NACCE and is an early childhood educator, wrote a book called Stories of Resistance, Learning from Black Women and Early Educators. And she is going to join us on Wednesday, June 10th at 7 p.m. to talk about her book. And then our May book, I can tell you what the book is. It's called We Are Who We're Waiting For, the new book out by Kisa Marks. And it's a love letter to Black children about liberation pedagogy and the early years. And I'm super excited. Actually, I wrote a blurb, but I also wrote a little essay. Like I remember her asking me for it, and then I was like, "Did my essay make the book?" And
Ah,
it did. I was super
nice.
excited. So I got to talk about play in there a little bit. So we're going to talk about that in May. I will let you when you get the recording email, it'll have the date. I'll have that all finalized with Kisa to discuss her book. And then you can find all the recordings if you missed any of our previous discussions. We did a book on play called Not Just Cute with Amanda Morgan. We did a book on Teaching Love and Justice with Kirsten Cole. And we just recently did Using Schema Play to advocate for early childhood with Heather Burnt Santee. So all of them are recorded and up, and this one will be next to join us. So thanks again,
So
everyone. Thanks for
appreciate
joining us.
defending the
And
early years
yes,
and
Thank
all of
you.
thank
you for
you.
being here.
Yeah. Thanks so
Yeah, thank you
much.
so
Girl, you
much. All
do.
right.
And
Thank
Denisha,
you.
thank you.